Mosby's Gold, Part 2, 1865. Virgil grieved for his brother for a second time, but he had to push on. He had delayed too long already. Orders had come down before this farce had even started for General Sheridan to take most of the troops of the Shenandoah and head southwest down the valley in support of Grant trying to crush Lee's army of the Virginia at Petersburg, leaving General Winfield Scott Hancock with only a token force in northern Virginia, where almost all had been laid to waste. Virgil's command was to head out. Damn the luck. Orders couldn't have come at a worse time, but fate and the army waited for no one, Virgil mused. They had recovered almost a dozen gold bars from the saddlebags of some of the fallen rebels' horses. Not the fortune to secure the future against uncertain times after the war that Eli had envisioned, but a handsome sum nonetheless. After dividing with those of the small force that were left, it still left Virgil with enough to keep the family farm going when he returned. He prayed silently for his brother's soul, and knew he would mourn him more in the days and weeks to come. Spring, 1993. The old man sat rocking quietly in the front of the cold hearth in the old hickory rocker his granddaddy had made. He was a study in contrast. His snow-white nappy hair contrasted his dark ebony skin that seemed stretched too tightly over a thin, frail-looking, almost skeleton form, but with toughness and strength of a man half his 70 years. The thin form contrasted with his deep booming voice, and the toughness contrasted with his gentle manner and demeanor. His eyes shone with wisdom seldom found anywhere, gained through coming to terms with a hard life and experiences far beyond his many years. He had lived the hard life of poverty and lack of civil rights for a black man in the South, but had come through it with a kind of contentedness and understanding of those weaker than himself. Finally, his quiet solitude on the outside, the biggest contrast of all, was hiding the turmoil and fear, the likes of which he had never known, that raced through his entire being behind his large, solemn, dark brown eyes. Heavy footsteps pounded suddenly across the front porch, and his grandson burst through the door, his chest heaving breathlessly. Again the contrast as the old man's eyes held his grandson's. The old man solemn, all-knowing, the grandson's wild and angry, like a cornered animal. No words passed between the two, just the younger man's labored breathing. Just as the old man opened his mouth to speak, more footsteps stumbled across the porch, announcing the old man's son. He too breathed heavily and sweated freely. His eyes betrayed only sadness and failure. The old man had a fleeting thought. The two men looked so much like he had at earlier times in his life. So it went badly. The old man's voice resonated, already knowing the answer. Yeah, his son managed, nodding, clutching his chest, trying to get air. That ain't the fucking half of it, the grandson spat, half bending over, hands on his knees as he too tried to get his breathing back to normal. The old man seemed to visibly shrink inward on himself as he stopped rocking and muttered, "What can be worse than failure? Either we succeed in this, or we fail. There are no degrees to either." "Alarms everywhere," the grandson volunteered. "We had to run the whole way back, in case they were wired to the man." "That ain't the worst of it," the boy's father admitted, looking at his own father's eyes and seeing the pain there under the surface. He hated to make it worse, but he knew better than to lie to the old man. "I think he's seen me. You know, the white man living there." "Motherfucker," the young boy said in exasperation. "I told you I could do it myself, Gran." "Watch your mouth, boy," the old man boomed, his gentle eyes turning hard as he locked eyes with his grandson. "You will show respect, boy. You understand?" The youth stood up, hands on his hips, and tried staring the old man down. It was no contest. The boy looked down after a long moment and nodded his acceptance and muttered, "Sorry," in the direction of his father. "It's all right. We all tense right now," his father said, trying to lighten the sting of the rebuke. "Y'all didn't take nothing then?" the old man questioned. "No time," his son answered, nodding. "It's like Cece said. Alarms everywhere. The house, even the tent. I took one step inside and damn near turned white. The noise scared me so bad. The house was the same way. Door wasn't even locked, but I took one step and wham!" Young Cece clapped his hands together for emphasis. The old man was quiet for a moment, his brow knitted in thought. Then he looked up at his son. "Tell me why you think y'all was seen," he questioned. "Well, when we hit the woods behind the house, Cece was in front of me, and just about the same time the white man pulled up in that blue BMW of that red-headed real estate lady. He jumped out and ran for the house. Anyway, he rolled his eyes and took a breath trying to get to the point. I hung back to see if he was yelling for the lady to call the sheriff, and I saw him looking out the window right at me as I was ducking into the brush. He finished, looking back and forth between his father and son. "He done seen y'all then," the old man nodded sagely. "Round here, white man sees a black man running from alarms, even when they ain't there." The youth started to comment, but thought better of it, looking at his grandfather's dark eyes. The old man sat quietly for a moment, surveying his son and grandson before him. He thought, 3 generations sitting in this room where 5 generations had lived, and it might all be lost soon. He was Samuel Calhoun, the second, grandson of a slave, Samuel Calhoun the first, houseboy to the Connell family whose house the 2 before him had tried to burglarize. He was an honest man, but these were desperate times. He looked on his spawn with pride. They would do whatever it took to save their family home. The simple, modest house that had been home to his family was built by his grandfather on land given to him by Myra Connell when he reached adulthood for the hard work and devotion he had shown Myra's family since childhood. As a slave, and, after the war, as a paid worker, Myra had given Samuel 50 acres of land at the corner of the Connell property. Indeed, that devotion started by Samuel the first as a slave still carried on today. It had been Samuel, his wife, his young son, and his aging father who had taken care of the extremely elderly Myra in her last years, and had closed up the house as she left it after her death, and were largely responsible for the house not being looted and torn apart after all these years. Now, after all this time, more than 110 years in his family, they were saying he didn't have a clear title to the land and to the house. They said the records must have been lost when the county went to computers. Bullshit, he said. The land was valuable, prime for farming and a real gem to a developer. It didn't take a genius to see the trendy house estates, and even private roads popping up all around. Only a little less than an hour commute from here to the huge metroplex of Washington, D.C., that was ever expanding into the rolling hills of Virginia and Maryland. Samuel thought the records being lost were convenient to the rising property values in the area, but it was nothing he could prove. He knew there was more than one person angry at the fact that a black family with a rundown-looking old house was occupying 50 prime acres near all these expensive new properties. They said the matter was easily settled. Provide the documentation necessary to prove ownership, or be the highest bidder when the Connell property was auctioned next month. Samuel thought he knew fear. He had fought the Germans in World War II. He had fought the Klan and basic racism of the South his whole life. He wrestled with a different kind of fear when his own son, Wilton, who stood before him now, went off to his own war in Vietnam. But none of that came close to the gnawing that was taking place in him now. The thought of losing all he had ever known and letting his family down was like no fear he had ever known. The key lay in the Connell house and old Myra's things. She wrote down everything, no matter how inconsequential. The proof of the deed was there, if it was anywhere. He was sure there would be proof there, as well as something only he knew of. It had been passed down through the generations, from Samuel the first, the former slave, to his son, from there to his own father, and finally to Samuel. He hadn't ever passed it on to his son yet. He didn't know why. It didn't seem as important now as it had while old Myra had still been alive, but he knew proof of that would make a difference too. He was the only living person that knew this secret. He took comfort in that. Samuel gazed at his son Wilton and his grandson Cal. They called him Cece for Calvin Calhoun. Wilton hadn't been the same since coming back from Vietnam 20 years before. He'd been moody and restless. Then, when his wife died giving birth to Cal, he had turned wild and mean. Spent 3 years in prison for aggravated assault. His sentence hadn't been that long, but a series of brutal fights while he was in had lengthened his stay. Samuel blamed the war for the change in Wilton. Then, with the loss of his wife, he just didn't know how to handle pain anymore. But he had steadied himself these last few years, and had tamed the rage inside him. Now it was the young one he worried about, Cece. He was defiant and proud. Well, that seemed to run in the family, Samuel thought with a smile. But he didn't understand this here generation. He shook his head sadly. They were all at fault, white, black, losing sight of the values that had built this country and kept it strong. Samuel shook his head to clear his thoughts. I must be getting old, he muttered. What was that, Daddy? Wilton spoke up, looking at him puzzled. Samuel waved his hand in dismissal. Nothing. Y'all done good. If the sheriff ain't here soon, it means he didn't call him. He tells them he saw a black man. They'll be over here after your black ass, Wilton. You be knowing that, I hope. They locked eyes and Wilton couldn't hold his gaze. He felt like he had let the old man down, and as crusty and old as he was, Wilton still felt shame every time he disappointed his father. The old man began rocking again, looking in a far-off distance, but this time his mind stayed focused on the matter at hand. I get a different feeling about this man, he mused. He don't seem to be no pampered white yuppie. The way he moved right in over to the manor and started right to work, and work hard. Mind y'all, he got that old place straightened up real quick. Samuel paused, letting a hint of admiration slip into his voice. He didn't seem to be no rednecker either. Samuel continued after a short pause. No, I get the feeling he'd be an honest-to-goodness man. You know what I mean? He asked, looking from Cece to Wilton, and back. A smile crept slowly across his dark, craggy face, as a brilliantly simple plan came to mind. Nope, when I see him, I see a man you can talk to, reason with, strike a deal maybe. Yup, I think our next step be paying Mr. White Man over to the house a neighborly visit, he finished, nodding to himself and grinning hugely. Both father and son looked at each other, then to the old man like he was out of his mind. Cece lifted his hands, then let them fall into feet, shaking his head slowly. He looked at his grandfather with doubt. Come on, Gramps, that's crazy and you know it. After today, he'd just use it as an excuse to call the sheriff on Pop. Yeah, Daddy, that goes against everything you ever said. You always said, don't trust a white man till you get to know him. Be polite, deal with him, but don't trust him. And after you get to know him, trust him even less. Now correct me if I'm wrong, for us to go talk to this man and explain the situation and hope he'll help us, don't we have to trust him? Wilton questioned. 1, why should he help us? What's in it for him? And 2, what's to stop him from tearing up the proof and saying this land's his? Old Samuel kept rocking, a sly smile crossing his face. Good words to live by, boy, and don't y'all forget 'em if I do say so myself. But what y'all gots to understand is these are desperate times, and desperate times call for desperate actions. So we talk to the man, and if he don't see it our way, we persuade him. And if he still don't see it our way, well, we'll do something even more desperate. Y'all understand me? He looked from one to the other, and pried his ancient form out of the rocker, ignoring his creaking, painful joints, and stood to his full height. Then with a withering gaze that burned through his son and grandson alike, his voice boomed. This has been our land for 5 generations, and as long as I'm alive, I'll be damned if I'm gonna sit by and watch someone steal it over some damn computer error. No man, white or black, is gonna move our family from this spot. He finished his fiery speech, with his eyes blazing like a zealot, and one finger pointed to the floor to emphasize his point. Both men were riveted to the spot by the old man's passion. Cece was the first to react. Okay, Gramps, okay, just chill, man. You know, you gotta keep off that. You keep going off like something's gonna blow. The boy's right, Daddy. Settle down some. You getting worked up this way isn't good for you. You know what the doctor said about your blood pressure. Besides, Cece and me are gonna do everything we can. You ought to know that, Wilton soothed. Old Samuel stood his ground and just glared at the 2 younger men. Huh, he grunted after a moment, then resumed his seat. His eyes slipped far into a faraway look as he stared off in the distance. Wilton looked at Cece, then back to his father. They exchanged a look, then Wilton spoke softly. All right, Daddy, whatever you want. You want us to talk to the man? Then we'll talk to the man. Old Samuel closed his eyes and nodded slowly. Then after a minute, he spoke in a low, solemn tone. We talked to the man. Then... He paused so long that Wilton and Cece thought he had fallen asleep until he abruptly continued. Then we protect what's ours. Y'all hear me? I see bad times coming. Bad times. We gotta protect what's ours. Everyone else be damned. He spoke in a whisper, but still had the same fiery intensity. Wilton and Cece exchanged another look, not knowing why both men felt the older man's dread. They knew what it might come to. The bright blue Z28 Camaro hugged the road as it shot down Route 522. Eric gripped the wheel of the shiny new car. a relaxed smile of contentment on his face. He had just passed through the sleepy little town of Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, and was speeding towards the Virginia state line. Passing Cacapon State Park, he noted with satisfaction how the road stretched out in front of him, like a ribbon as far as the eye could see. He knew from many trips to see Sean in Norfolk that the Virginia state line was just over the rise in the distance. Once in Virginia, the road turned into a series of tight turns as it traveled through the foothills of the Blue Ridge on its way to Winchester. He was looking forward to testing the way the car handled. The mountains rose sharply to his right, seemingly following the contour of the border, making West Virginia seem like a huge fortress. Driving through here always made Eric think of the old John Denver song, and he started to sing. Eric's right foot pushed down further on the car's accelerator, and the purring V8 engine growled as the car shot forward effortlessly. Eric grinned broadly at the feeling of the power that surged through his fingertips from the car. He felt good, relaxed, better than he felt about himself in years. After Sean's appearance, their father's estate had finally been settled. There'd been enough money to pay off the debt from his divorce, buy his kids some presents, and make a healthy down payment on his new car. He knew he should have used the money elsewhere, but sometimes you just had to say what the hell and do something just to make yourself feel better. Eric topped the rise and sped past the big blue sign indicating he had entered Virginia. He felt a pang of disappointment when he noted the road construction, and hoped it wouldn't continue all the way to Winchester. But all in all, things couldn't be better. Eric felt like a new man, especially with the extra financial burden lifted. He had reached his goal of losing 20 pounds, and sported a new haircut. He couldn't wait to surprise Sean. He was leaner, looked healthy, and felt better than he had in years. He had set his goals, and he had met them. Things were starting to go his way. Even his disposition had changed. He felt like a new man. Eric had been thinking hard of Sean's offer, about the two of them teaming up in business, or how Sean said it in their last talk, some new adventure. Now he had the confidence. It was amazing how completing one goal and seeing positive progress could change your whole mindset. Now Eric felt ready to meet any challenge, and he had his brother to thank. After that first weekend when they had cleared the air, in their weekly talks, Sean had coached Eric along. Eric had made amazing progress without the negative pull of his father's judgments, put-downs, and his own constant failures. He now knew failure was only temporary, and not some warped destiny. He felt like a new man, and he was proud of it. His feeling of disappointment faded quickly as the construction area passed, and he found himself on a newly surfaced 4-lane highway, instead of the old narrow 2-lane road. "Woo!" Eric shouted as he pushed the car to its limit. He felt his new confidence surge through him and into the car. He knew he could push the car forever, that his sheer force of will hold it to the road. In no time at all, he found himself sitting in a stoplight just outside of Winchester, feeling a slight sense of loss. His adrenaline rush faded. He was still feeling content knowing that 6 months before, he had never been able to do what he had just done. He would have lost his nerve and wrecked. As he began to wind his way through the streets of the old city, he anticipated the reunion with his brother and reflected on the last time he had talked to Sean at the beginning of the week. Sean had been excited but vague, but Eric could hear it in his voice. Sean said he was calling from Dulles International Airport outside of Washington. He was getting ready to hop a flight to Miami on his first real live assignment for Security International. He was headed down to Florida to consult with some rich old Cuban who was paranoid old Fidel was sending hit teams after him. Sean was to show the ineptness of his current security and make recommendations on upgrades and try to sell him upgrades through his firm. Sean had admitted to being excited about it, but he said there was something really, really big brewing at home. "Wait till you get here, you won't believe it," he had said. Then, when Eric had pressed him, he changed the subject. Sean said he'd only be gone a day or two, and he'd be back in plenty of time for Eric's arrival on Good Friday. Eric asked him again what the big deal was, and again Sean evaded him. He told Eric they had been invited to Easter dinner at a family home of the woman Sean had been seeing. "Wait until you meet Abby, Eric," Sean confided. "I've never met anyone like her." Eric grinned smugly, thinking, boy, she must be some hot number for Sean to go on like this. He never usually did give them more than a long look or have an occasional one-night stand. He picked up Route 5017 at the southern end of Winchester, noting with satisfaction that he would be at Sean's within the hour. What could be the big deal? He thought. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get any clues out of Sean, except for a couple of obscure things that didn't make any sense. Eric sat there trying to remember Sean's exact words. "You ever hear of Colonel Mosby?" he asked. "No," Eric remembered saying. "You're the ex-military man, not me, bro. Come on, Sean, give me a clue that makes sense." Okay, Sean answered like he was talking to a child. "How about, you remember our hike with Dad from Crandon Park Beach to the lighthouse, right?" the tiny voice over the phone asked. "Sure," Eric had said. "We talked about it when you were up here. What about it?" "Nothing," Sean had answered smugly. "That's the clue." Eric remembered his frustration. Was this Colonel Mosby somebody in Miami? Or did we meet him that day on Key Biscayne? Eric prodded, but it was no use. Sean wouldn't give up any more, other than to say if he thought about it, he'd figure it out. Well, no matter, he thought. 20 minutes or so, and Sean can just explain it to me. He looked ahead toward the rapidly approaching mountains. "This is beautiful," he said out loud. "No wonder Sean wants to live here." Something caught his eye at the edge of the highway, and Eric stomped his foot on the brakes. The car slowed sharply, but he retained control thanks to the anti-lock brakes. Eric double-checked over his shoulder for oncoming traffic, then threw his car in reverse. The tires squealed in protest as Eric backed up, then shifted into drive and pulled off the shoulder. "Well, I'll be damned," he said slowly as he read the black and white historical marker. He read the marker twice, but was still baffled. "Colonel John Singleton Mosby," it began, "led many of his raids along this highway during the Civil War." Okay, now I've heard of him, but what has that got to do with Sean and me hiking with Dad when we were kids in Florida? Still confused, Eric waited for a group of cars to pass, then pulled back onto the road and quickly overtook and passed the other cars. Another sign caught his attention and he laughed, this one green and white, indicating he was traveling on John S. Mosby Highway. Eric shook his head. He had been down this road 100 times and never noticed either sign before. Now, twice within a few miles, he sees the name again? "I must be the only one around here who's never heard of this guy," he said to his reflection in the rearview mirror. After passing through Ashby's Gap, Route 17 turned south, splitting from Route 50 at the little burg of Paris. Eric made the turn onto the narrower 2-lane Route 17 and kept on. He passed beautiful antebellum homes sitting back off the road and saw the turnoff to Sky Meadows State Park. One route to Sean's lay just ahead. Eric saw the sign for County Road 688, but stayed on Route 17. Sean had told him he could go by way of 688, but the road was kind of rough. With his new car, Eric wanted to baby it, so he opted for the slightly longer route. He was almost there in any case. A few more miles and Route 17 would junction with Interstate 66. And then 5 miles or so of that, and 17 would exit and head to either Marshall or Warrenton, while I-66 headed to Washington, D.C. The road that led to Sean's house was just off the exit heading towards Warrenton. Eric couldn't remember a road there, but he hadn't seen the signs about Mosby before either. The miles passed pleasantly as the shiny car growled on, and in no time Eric found himself exiting off I-66 where Route 17 headed toward Warrenton. Sure enough, just ahead was a narrow 2-lane road to the right. Eric made the turn and kept going straight as another road intersected to the right almost immediately. Boy, it'd be easy to veer off that way and get completely lost, Eric thought, as he headed slowly down the road, not wanting to get lost now that he was so close. The road gently twisted and turned with gentle dips and rises, always hiding what was just ahead. As he topped a rise after 4 or 5 miles, he glimpsed and saw flashing lights of emergency vehicles in the near distance. Must be a wreck, he thought absently as he slowed down further and proceeded cautiously. He went down in a dip and lost sight of the lights. He went through another series of curves and was just beginning to think his mind was playing tricks on him when he topped the rise, and there, directly in front of him, was a sheriff's deputy in a flat-brimmed campaign hat, motioning him to slow down but keep moving. Further ahead, 2 brown sheriff's cruisers were pulled off to the left side of the road, while another grim-faced deputy, looking identical to the first, directed traffic. 4 more cars with flashing lights and 2 EMS vehicles were converged in the front yard of an old frame house to the left. Eric was instructed to stop by hand signals while several cars passed the other way. He used this time to quickly study the scene with the macabre sense of fascination that strikes people at roadside accidents. But what he saw made him realize his first guess of a car accident was wrong. The problem seemed to be up by the house itself. As he started to move forward, he saw several deputies beginning to stretch yellow crime scene tape around the outside of the house. Eric's eyes flicked back and forth between the scene to his left and the road where he had to avoid yet another deputy. Just as he was thinking this would be some good local gossip to fill his brother in on, his sense of well-being was shattered, and his new fortitude crumbled. As he passed the driveway and looked quickly back over his shoulder, he glimpsed the unmistakable outline of Sean's two-tone wagoneer. Horror filled him and threatened to choke him. His foot unconsciously slammed on the brake, and he sat there stunned as a panic welled up inside him. Behind him, a horn blew. Eric didn't hear it, and was still sitting there panic-struck when a deputy knocked on his window. He absently rolled it down, but didn't hear the words the deputy spoke, then yelled. Eric all of a sudden gunned his engine and pulled his car off the edge of the road, jumped out, and began to run toward the house. The deputy by the car began to holler and give chase. Then 2 more deputies by the house moved in to head Eric off. Eric tried to evade the 2 coming at him. He dropped his shoulder like he was going to try to bull charge through them. Then at the last instant, he faked inside and cut to the outside. Just as he thought he was past, the first deputy giving chase blindsided him, knocking him roughly to the ground. The other 2 piled on, and after a few heated moments, Eric was cuffed and being pushed face first into the moist earth.